Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what is the first of two conversations with ambassadors that we will have. This is your fault.
Been a long day.
Okay, here we go. Tomorrow we are having noon, same place. 5 U.S. ambassadors to Caribbean countries visit us and have a conversation like we're going to have today with 5 of our ambassadors to Central America and the deputy administrator, assistant administrator, Mike Fierstein, who's joining us here from USAID. Thank you all for being here. My name, by the way, is Frank Moore. I'm the director of the Latin American and Caribbean Center. Well, Central America is in the news again. Almost like it's the 1980s all over again, but not really, and for very different reasons. So we're having this session at a very timely moment. As I think many of you know, the president recently in his budgetary submission to the Congress is requesting $1 billion to support governance issues, development issues, security programs in Central America. Well, for most of Central America. And we want to have certainly a discussion about that. But before we start, I think I'd like to at least briefly introduce our distinguished guests, and I'll go from in this direction, my immediate left. Todd Robinson. Ambassador Robinson is our ambassador to Republic of Guatemala and has been in his job since September of 2014. Ambassador Robinson is a career Foreign Service officer. He has served really a number of places, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but in Europe. And he is the recipient of 2 State Department awards. I actually met Ambassador Robinson when he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau, which is when I was asking him for money, and he never responded in kind.
I give you water.
Thank you, Ambassador, for being here. Ambassador Mari Carmen Aponte. She has been our ambassador to El Salvador since September of 2010. She is an attorney, a very distinguished attorney, practicing law in Washington, D.C., and she has served on a number of board of directors, particularly the one of the National Council of La Raza. And she also became a very good and close friend during our time together in government. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being here.
Thank you.
Then we have, of course, Ambassador Carlos Moreno. He has also just relatively recently arrived to his post as our ambassador to Belize since June of 2014. Ambassador Moreno is also a lawyer and a judge. He served as Associate Justice on the California Supreme Court from 2001 to 2011. And he is and has served as president of the Mexican American Bar Association. As I mentioned, he served and has held a number of legal judgeships as well, positions in the state of California. Ambassador, thank you also for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Ambassador Powers, also a Foreign Service officer. She has been in her post, I think, longer than most people here, perhaps.
Almost 3 years.
Almost 3 years, she says
But
this,
who's counting?
as our ambassador to Nicaragua. Just prior to that, actually, she was our ambassador to Panama, which is when we met. She has also held a number of posts throughout, really, the globe, including our director of the Office of Provincial Affairs at the embassy, U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, Iraq. She's also worked on counter-narcotics issues in Colombia. So thank you also, Ambassador Powers, for joining us here for this discussion.
It's a pleasure.
Ambassador Nealon is also recently arrived to his post as our ambassador to Honduras. He was, up until very recently, served as the civilian deputy to the commander of U.S. Southern Command here in Miami from September of 2013 to August 2014. He's also served in a number of places and has been charge or deputy chief of mission in Uruguay, as well as in Canada, which is when we met. Thank you, Ambassador Nealon. And of course, good friend, also oftentimes asking for money unsuccessfully, our deputy administrator and our associate administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean. He is in an acting basis, I believe, right, Mark, as deputy administrator for USAID. He has served as assistant administrator now since 2009, right, Mark? So he's been in this position and really managing, running all of our programs in Latin American development programs. And so, Mark, thank you again for being here and for joining us for this discussion. So we're going to have a conversation. We're going to make sure that we bring this audience into the conversation. So, but as agreed upon, I think it would be a good idea for each of you to give brief remarks, 5-minute remarks about your country as well as policy issues facing the United States in your respective countries. So why don't we start with you, Todd.
Great. Pleasure to be here. Todd Robinson. I've been in the Foreign Service for almost 30 years, and it's been a real honor and a privilege to represent my country abroad. I've really enjoyed it. I was particularly gratified to be named by the president to be nominated by the president to be ambassador to Guatemala. It is not my first time in Guatemala. I was the deputy chief of mission there from 2009 to 2011, so the number 2 in the embassy, and so it's been a little bit of a homecoming. That's the good news. The bad news is many of the issues, many of the challenges that I was dealing with in Guatemala from 2009 to 2011, I find I'm still dealing with today. My 3 areas of focus, almost from day one, has been education, poverty alleviation or economic opportunities, and security. And my guess is over the next 3 years, broadly speaking, if the president's budget request is granted, is authorized, whatever part of it Guatemala gets will be focused largely on those 3 areas. Guatemala, as you probably all know, is really the gateway to the north for any number of things. Recently, it's been the gateway to the north for people and drugs. And we can talk a little bit more about that as we continue our conversation, but the influence of criminal organizations, criminal activity in Guatemala has been pervasive. It characterizes almost all of the areas that would cause people to leave the country. It's part of the violence. The corruption takes away the resources, most of the resources, a lot of the resources that the population is looking for. That means poor education opportunities, almost no economic opportunity, and high levels of insecurity, violence, crime, those kind of things. I would argue that there are some bright spots. There are some areas where we have seen, and actually Mark will probably raise some of the areas where we've seen advances on the development side, on some indicators for on the health side, but largely the northern tier countries and Guatemala as one of the leaders in the region are beset by challenges that are going to force us collectively, I think, to figure out a way to apply the resources, the necessary resources that we're going to get in a way that will really give us an opportunity to advance, support institutions, and make a difference. The last thing I will say really quickly is the one thing that I have seen in my time in Guatemala is that there are about two Guatemalas going on. There's what's going on in the capital, and if any of you have been to Guatemala City, it looks very modern. There are hotels, there are places to eat, and you can go about 5 or 10 miles in any direction from the capital, and there's a very different Guatemala going on. And it is striking to me. I was just traveling with the counselor of the State Department, Ambassador Tom Shannon. We drove to the Western Highlands from Guatemala City, and the change is striking. The challenges outside of Guatemala City. Guatemala City has its challenges as well, but the challenges outside of Guatemala City are such that it can take your breath away. And we are all struggling. I'm certainly struggling to partner with the current government and what is soon to be a new government in addressing the issues that we face, very serious issues that we face.
Thank you. Ambassador Aponte.
It's really a pleasure to be here with so many young people today. And I want to announce that, not you guys. I want to announce that there are people, I brought in my team to help me answer questions about El Salvador. So Jason Morales, who served with me in the embassy, get ready. You're going to get some of the questions. And I know that Mr. Cruz también, who is Salvadorian and who has kept abreast of all the issues in El Salvador, will also be very helpful. Challenging, but also helpful. If we were to say that the priorities of any administration in the United States are based on budgetary considerations, there is no question of where Central America is in President Obama's administration. I have to concede that I am what is diplomatically called a non-career ambassador, but in the street we call people like me political ambassadors. So we have not come through the system, so we have sometimes a different point of view, but what we all share is incredibly good Foreign Service officers that I listen to and who keep me straight. But getting back to the budgetary considerations and how they underline the importance of a region, there is no question that this $1 billion that President Obama has asked for in the next budget is a signal of how he views at least Central America, the Northern Triangle in particular, but Central America in general. My sense is that some of you, and maybe all of you, are going to be asking how is this $1 billion going to be spent, and what are the priorities, and can it be spent appropriately? Well, in El Salvador, we have the advantage of having a program that we have been working for about 4 years called Partnership for Growth, in which we have taken a look and worked with the Salvadorian government in the priorities that constrain El Salvador's economic growth. And they are two. As is obvious, security is number one, and by far the greatest constraint to economic growth in El Salvador. And the second one is competitiveness. And so we have been working for the last 3 years, and focusing on all the areas. We have about 150 lines of actions and 20 projects that we work on. And I'm sure that Mark, who is very well aware and in tune with the Partnership for Growth, will tell us a little bit more about it. But it really, what it really gives El Salvador is an advantage of how to deal with an infusion of potential monies that is going to come that will double the budget that we have been spending in that country. It also has helped the embassy to focus and integrate and work together much better as a team in trying to get, number one, the funds spent, but number two, efficiencies and results. They have not been as quick as we would want them to be, but we are committed to doing at least Partnership for Growth and now the Alianza para la Prosperidad as a long-term project, and that's the key, long-term project. If you want change in Central America, it has to be long-term, one has to be patient, and we will get there. And I am hopeful that because El Salvador is so well-positioned with the experience of the last 3 years, that we will have an edge. I'm going to be open for questions, but I want to make sure that my colleagues can also talk.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Moreno.
Thank you, Dr. Mort. It's a pleasure also to be here. And you mentioned that yesterday you had a panel of ambassadors from the Caribbean. Tomorrow. Well, I feel I could participate in that one as well. Because, yeah, well, no. Belize is in the unique position of being both Central American and Caribbean, and that's based on its historical antecedents as a British colony, much aligned with the Caribbean in so many respects. It's, I think, one of 2 English-speaking countries officially in Latin America, and many of the English traditions, including its legal system, is based on the common law and derived from the English. In that sense, it's a good fit for someone like me who's entering his 40th year in the legal business, about 15 as a lawyer, business lawyer, and 25 as a judge at all different levels. And Belize is also, I think, the smallest country represented here in terms of population, about 350,000. But notwithstanding its size, it's a very heterogeneous country in terms of culture and diversity and language and people, ranging from the original English to the Creole to the Hispanics to the Mennonites, the Garifuna, and of course the Mayans have always been there, as they've been in Guatemala and in Honduras. So it's been a very challenging assignment for me. I'm also a so-called political appointee, and I'm new to the argot of the State Department and all the acronyms and so forth. But I think I bring something to the table based on my experience as a trial judge in particular. Probably the most pressing issue in Belize, it deals with citizen security. That's not all. And what I think I can bring to the table, and am bringing to the table, is a background in rule of law. Because to me, rule of law is really at the centerpiece of what the State Department is interested in doing, and not only in Belize, but in the countries that are represented up here. And our sense is that given Belize's size and the common law system, that it's challenging, but I think it can serve an example as to how it can be done because of its small scales. We face many of the same problems that have been alluded to in terms of citizen security, narco trafficking, trafficking in persons and so forth, and in an economy that is tremendously undersourced. So when I look at the rule of law piece, and that's what I've spent probably a lot of my time in, we have funding to address training of the police, not only reforming or rebuilding their police academy, but providing equipment, automobiles, vehicles of all different sorts, training in terms of investigation, equipment, fingerprinting equipment, and other types of tools that the police can use. We also provide training to prosecutors, particularly in terms of dealing with what we would call white-collar paper crimes, money laundering, and so forth. We have extensive programs in that respect. And we're also entering into some judicial training, something that I have some background in. Now, one of the key things that I think rule of law can do is to strengthen the governance of a country. And we're very lucky in Belize to have a Chief Justice who is very committed to judicial reform. In that regard, the U.S. has partnered with the United Kingdom to fund a criminal justice advisor who has essentially proposed the revamping, with the support of the Chief Justice, of the rules of criminal procedure. And I won't go into all of those, but in particular, the issue of speedy trial. We do have trial by jury, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, presumption of innocence, just like the English system. But speedy trial is an issue that we're discussing, the excessive adjournments or continuances that occur in the courtroom that's part of just sort of the legal culture, how cases just take so long to resolve. And I think we're making significant headway, and this year those rules should be implemented. We're also helping the courts in the sense of providing audiovisual equipment to link up the only prison and jail in Belize with the court, the main courtroom, Supreme Court, which is their trial court in Belize City, so that the transportation issues with respect to getting prisoners on time for court appearances, that can all be done through audiovisual arraignments and so forth, something that I've done in Los Angeles. So we're providing recording equipment for the courtrooms. We're providing recording equipment and cameras for the police. You've seen a lot of, it seems that a day doesn't go by where you see some footage in the United States using a mounted camera on a police vehicle or police officer. So all of these sort of ideas we're sharing with them. About 10 days ago, I had the pleasure of helping to rededicate the reopening of a courthouse in Punta Gorda, which is at the south of the country. A courthouse whose interior burned down in 2013, but with the assistance of some State Department funds and with the Belizean labor, and it was actually a modest amount of funds when I learned how much it was, we really revamped that courthouse. I'm now assisting UNICEF on a UNICEF project in helping to build a children's court. I've had experience in that in foster care in California, and in fact, I obtained the assistance of judges in California and Los Angeles to send some pictures of the courtrooms where children's cases are heard, where you have sort of downsized facilities and so forth. And that's just happened yesterday, as a matter of fact. So there's a whole panoply of things that we're doing, and I hope to continue using some of the experiences I've had as a trial judge and as an appellate judge to help Belize come along the way. And my sense, my strong belief is that we've been learning about the new Central American strategy in terms of prosperity, governance, and security. Well, when many people think about the judicial system, the criminal justice system, they think of citizen security and and working with gangs and so forth. We're certainly doing all of that. But I think of citizen security and strong governance in the judicial system as being essential to economic development. I mean, investors, whether they're foreign or domestic, are not going to come to a country if they feel that they're not playing on a level playing field, if justice is delayed or denied, if there's a sense that the system is corrupt, if the judgments are not timely. All of these things, I think, will lead to prosperity or economic investment. So, I may be biased given my perspective, but I think it really is the centerpiece for a new Belize. And just to conclude, there are other things that I'm working on. Belize has about over 50% of its land territory is in protected status. I mean, there are reserves that, whether terrestrial or marine, we have a unique sort of way of managing those. It's a public-private partnership. The environmental NGOs in Belize have done a terrific job of taking over that responsibility. So our embassy is working on some initiatives with that. One example would be using our so-called soft INL money. This is law enforcement type money to help train forest rangers. We hope to create a marine academy, again, to protect the species in the ocean, to protect the trees and the logging and the flora and fauna that are in the protected terrestrial areas, but with a forest ranger kind of perspective, because I think that's where one of the tricks I've learned as a non-career is you've got to find the proper source of money to do things. The other area, briefly, that I'll just touch upon is LGBTI rights. That's something that our State Department and Human Rights section has taken a very strong position on that, seeking the repeal of some anti-sodomy laws that, again, are vestiges of the old English system. There's a challenge right now that's being submitted in the trial court. And that's also an issue that I have some experience in. 7 years ago, I was part of the 4-3 majority on the California Supreme Court that overruled the statutes against gay marriage. A year later, of course, that was overturned, and I was the only dissenting judge. And now, in the year 2015, we have 38 states and the District of Columbia. And it looks like by the end of, by the middle of this year, we'll get the view of the U.S. Supreme Court. So I've been proud to be part of that sort of movement in my own lifetime.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Ambassador Powers?
Okay. I'm Phyllis Powers, and I'm currently the ambassador to Nicaragua from the United States. Unlike my colleagues here, Nicaragua is not a country that's got a huge foreign assistance budget from the United States. It is the second poorest country in the hemisphere with no shortage of challenges, both economically and politically. But I can tell you, we work fairly well with the Nicaraguan government on issues of mutual importance, economic growth for the country, regional security issues to include counter-narcotics and trafficking in persons and criminal organizations writ large, and on a wide variety of other issues as they come up. Where we don't agree, I've tried very hard to disagree in a respectful way with the government, and we continue to move forward with the bilateral relationship. But for my mission, what has been since my arrival, and probably before, is the cornerstone of what the new Central American strategy is all about. Economic prosperity, security, and democratic governance for the people of a country, to have their human rights protected, to know that they've got a transparent system of justice that they can rely on throughout their country. So I was quite pleased with what came out of the Central American strategy, that, okay, we're hitting the points that we need to be hitting. and trying to make some progress. Ambassador Ponte's right. There is nothing short-term about what we're doing in Central America. If we're not talking long-term, or as I'm so wont to say even in my embassy, largo plazo, you're not talking about real development or real progress. It doesn't happen overnight. There are reasons, there are disagreements between whatever government, including the government of Nicaragua and the government of the United States. We have history in Central America, and that history plays a role in how we are perceived in these countries. And I can't tell you the number of times I've heard about William Walker. In serio. This is part of our history. And if we don't understand the history and understand how it is perceived, how our actions are perceived, then we can't begin to have a conversation with the country we're working with. So for my staff and I, it is all about remembering the history, remembering that we are diplomats invited and accredited in the country, to be careful we show respect to the country, to the people, and make sure we're reaching out not just to government, not just to private sector, but to the entire citizenry of the country. So for the programs we focus on more than anything with our very small budget are outreach programs, programs that are getting to the communities at the municipal level so that civil society organizations are learning how to function in the environment that they're in to help promote the needs and desires of the community that they're working in. So citizen responsibility to ensure that interests and views of the citizenry are getting to the municipal governments and hopefully then on up to the central governments. And that kind of governance programming is having an effect. I had a wonderful opportunity in Bluefields a few months ago to speak to some individuals who were part of one of those municipal programs, and the pride and the sense of accomplishment that they were able to work with their municipalities and the government to bring potable water to their neighborhoods, something that basic. And they had success as a result of it. Teaching young people to speak English so they're more competitive in the job market in Nicaragua, much less internationally, making them more competitive so they can apply to university and get scholarships, working to the future, the long term. And this has been and will continue to be our major focus. We work in counter-narcotics, absolutely. We work in programs of food security because it's poor and they need that food security to make sure kids have breakfast and lunch and can go to school. Working in ways that we can with the programs that we have through USAID to provide remedial education to young people who've had to quit school so that they can get a job and be able to work. Much of it located on the Atlantic coast, which is now the Caribbean coast. So that we're focused on areas where others haven't focused, but at the same time still doing things in the capital and on the West Coast where there's more activity and more economic development, but still a need to project out for the long term and make sure that people understand that we are neighbors, we are friends, and we want to be a positive element in the discussion and in the progress of the country. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Nealon.
Good evening. Thanks very much for the invitation. My name is Jim Nealon, and I'm the ambassador in Honduras. Been there since August. It is a great pleasure to be here and a special pleasure to see so many young people. I hope some of you are considering future in the Foreign Service, diplomacy, and if you are, I would love to talk to you after this and encourage you. Bear with me for 5 minutes. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of context about how we got to the point where we are today, where our president last week asked the Congress for $1 billion, billion with a B, for Central America, just because I think it's important to understand. How many people here have been to Honduras? That's a lot. That's actually more than I thought. But I assumed that there would be people here tonight who knew a lot about Honduras and people who knew not so much. But I'm sure that everyone in this room knows two things about Honduras because Honduras has been in the news for the past year. I'm sure everyone here knows that Honduras has, over the last few years, been beset by very, very high levels of violence. And you may have seen in the media that that level reached 86 people, deaths, murders per 100,000 population, which is a very, very high number. That was in 2012. And you also know that, because you saw it on the front page of the New York Times or saw it on TV, that last summer there was a crisis of unaccompanied children coming from the 3 northern tier countries crossing the border into our country. This crisis, the crisis of these unaccompanied children, led directly to a meeting last July between President Obama and the presidents of the 3 northern tier countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And at that meeting, President Obama said to the presidents, get me a plan so that we can help you mitigate this crisis of the unaccompanied children. The 3 northern tier countries, working with the Inter-American Development Bank, produced such a plan last fall, which is called the Alliance for Prosperity. Now, coincidentally, at the same time that they were producing this plan, the Alliance for Prosperity, the interagency, your government in Washington, was working on a Central American strategy that some of my colleagues have mentioned. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of coincidence between the plan produced by the Northern Triangle countries, the Alliance, and the Central American strategy produced by the United States government. And I would say that there's general agreement that it made sense to address the push factors. You know, anytime someone immigrates from one country to another, there are probably push factors and pull factors. But there was general agreement that we need to address these push factors. There was general agreement on what those push factors are. A lack of economic opportunities, including deep poverty, challenges to the educational system, a lack of investment and job creation. Second, violence and insecurity. I mentioned the 86 murders per 100,000 population, but also other criminality that sometimes more directly affects people on a day-to-day basis, things like extortion and kidnapping. And then historically weak governance, institutions that had been unable to deal with this huge spike in violence, weak civilian police forces, court systems, and sort of a reinforcing cycle of impunity, that is, crime that goes unpunished, and corruption. And so there was also general agreement that it makes sense, and it's a lot cheaper, to address these push factors at their source in Central America rather than at the U.S.-Mexican border, the 1-yard line, if you will, where it's already almost too late to mitigate, right? And it's also a lot more expensive. So there was a lot of agreement between the United States and the Northern Tier countries on what the push factors were. And then you may have seen that last Monday, President Obama, in his 2016 budget, has asked for $1 billion, with a B, dollars to spend in Central America to help mitigate these challenges. This would represent roughly a tripling of our current assistance budgets. Right? So it's not $1 billion new dollars, it's $1 billion total, including what we're already getting. So just to finish, I think there's an agreement in Washington. There's not always agreement in Washington, but sometimes there is, that the United States, has a clear interest in seeing a Central America that is peaceful, that is prosperous, which offers economic opportunities to its citizens, that's secure, where criminal behavior is punished, where the human rights of everyone are respected, and where Hondurans or Salvadorans or Guatemalans or other Central Americans see their future at home and not in the United States. Let me stop there. I'll be happy to talk about, as we go on, about what's happening today in Honduras.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mark?
Good evening. I'm the only one here who is not an ambassador, and that explains why when you got your flyers advertising this event, it had pictures of 5 of the participants. I was not featured, even though I am the best-looking guy up here. Not sure why you're laughing about that. But I do control $1 billion in my budget, which is a heck of a lot more than any of these ambassadors control.
We'll come see you.
He always says no.
Yeah, you'll have no more success than Frank ever had. But that figure is about to grow, as we've heard. The president has requested $1 billion total for Central America. in the FY16 budget. And what that will enable us to do is build on the many successes that we've had in recent years, and really over the last 5 decades. USAID was created in 1961, which means that everyone up here is actually younger than USAID, or at least I am. But we've actually been active in Central America since 1961 in a whole range of areas, working to improve health indicators, working on education, advancing democracy, human rights, working on governance issues, promoting agriculture, economic growth. And one of the areas that we've started to work on more intensely is the area of citizen security, which you've heard a lot about here already. And that is not a traditional area for development. When I studied international affairs and development some 30 years ago as an undergrad and then as a graduate student, we didn't, there was no reference to crime and violence as an obstacle to economic growth. And as we heard earlier, the studies that we've done, the studies the American Development Bank have done, has concluded that in certain countries, El Salvador, for example, Honduras, the leading constraint to economic growth, is in fact crime and violence. And that we concluded that as a development agency, we cannot be successful unless we also work to reduce crime and violence. So our piece of it is a development side. So investing in at-risk youth, ensuring they have educational opportunities, that they get workforce development opportunities, helping communities come together to design their own anti-crime strategies, working with police on community policing, investing on modest infrastructure to reduce crime in certain communities. So with this new infusion of money, we'll be able to scale up on the security side, but also other areas as well. And this is really an opportune time to do that, because we're seeing evidence of political will on the part of all these countries, as we've heard from the ambassadors. They're making some tough decisions. They're promoting economic reform, political reform. They're starting to raise new revenues. And we're seeing the international community mobilize as well. The U.S. government is clearly mobilizing. We've developed a new Central American strategy. The IDB is getting engaged, and other donors also. And I think we have a pretty good sense of what works, and I'll offer 2 examples. We do a lot to work with farmers to increase yields, to increase farmer income. And in this hemisphere, particularly in Haiti and in Guatemala and Honduras, and to a lesser extent in El Salvador as well. And we're seeing results. We're seeing farmers increasing their yields. They're getting better access to domestic markets, international markets. Their incomes are increasing, and poverty is being reduced. And then on the citizen security side, we've asked Vanderbilt University, or contracted Vanderbilt University, to do an assessment of our work in combating crime and violence. And they looked at communities where we were investing across Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and also in Panama. And they compared the results over 3 years in those communities with areas where we're not investing. And the results were dramatic. In the areas where USAID invested with local governments, with national governments, with the private sector, we saw pretty dramatic decreases in crime. The areas where we were not investing, we did not see such results. So with this new money, we'll be able to expand the geographic reach of our programs and also intensify the work that we're doing in various communities. Now, we recognize we are really a junior partner in all this to the governments in the region. We are not the most important actor. They are the ones who have to take the tough political decisions, make the tough political reforms, make some tough economic reforms as well. They're going to have to raise the bulk of the resources, but we'll contribute what we can. And the private sector is going to play a very, very important role as well. And we're starting to see both international companies, but also local companies really engaging. And they understand that the policies that have been pursued in the past, the Mano Dura policies, for example, to reduce crime, failed. And in fact, in many cases, were counterproductive. And they recognize that for their own profits, they need an environment in which crime and violence is reduced, in which extortion and murder rates come down. And they understand why it's important for them to invest in their own countries and invest in the youth in their countries. This is going to be a long-term process, as many of the speakers have noted, but we're seeing encouraging results already, and we're confident that if the countries in question continue to make the tough reforms, continue to invest their own resources, that combined we'll be able to get some really encouraging results in the coming years. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for your opening remarks. So let me start the conversation with a couple of questions, and we'll bring the audience in soon. So many of you noted that this is a long-term process, right? That this is almost kind of an investment that the United States government is making. And the vice president, in his op-ed in the New York Times, really was quite clear in saying that our partners really, if you will, need to step up to the plate. So, you know, we here in the United States, we're impatient people. And we like to see results tomorrow, right? And the kinds of challenges we're facing here cannot be resolved in a week, a month, or even in a year, even though, as Mark was saying, we're seeing some good results. So my question, and I'm not going to point at anybody, but anybody who wants to go after this one, is what happens if in a year, in this long-term process, we, the Congress, doesn't see the kind of results that we want and expect? What happens? I mean, is this an investment that we're making, an initial investment that we're making, the expectation that maybe another $1 billion will come in the next 2 or 3 years? Because as I said, we are impatient people. And we want to make sure that our money is being invested and that we're seeing a return out of that pretty quickly. So how would you react to that, Jim?
I'll jump in on that. You know, it's a really interesting question. We do have a very short attention span in the United States government, and I would say even as a nation. But at the same time, you know, there has to be an answer to a congressman or a senator who says, show me the results of the taxpayers' money that we've given you to spend in Honduras, right? You have to be able to show results. So I think in this case, if we really do get the new money that the president has asked for, we won't even see that money for about a year. We'll see it about a year from now, probably. Is that right, Mark?
Or even later, yeah.
Yeah, or even later. But that
By
said,
the time it's spent, yeah.
it's incumbent on us to have projects teed up in advance so that when that money comes, we can put it to work immediately. And I think we need to be ready to spend that money on projects that are already in motion, where we've already been able to demonstrate success, where we already have buy-in from our host government, and where it's just a matter of being able to double down or masificar, as you say in Spanish, on things that already work. So that's the thinking that we're doing right now in Honduras anyway.
How do we, this question, Mark and maybe Ambassador Aponte, how do we measure success? What's the metric we use to say it's having results, right? How do you interact with your host government, the foreign minister, and say, what measurement are we using to say this is now working? And how do you make sure that the money that's being used is going towards that particular metric of success?
Right.
The
go ahead.
advantage, I'm jumping in, but I'm sure, Mark, you can compliment me. The advantage that we have in El Salvador is that we are already, through Partnership for Growth, have metrics that we pull out publicly every 6 months on all our 21 lines of actions. And how are we doing? Are we on schedule? Are we behind schedule? And we put it, and we do this jointly. It's a joint evaluation that is done with the government of El Salvador. And sometimes the negotiations are tougher than others. But we manage to comply and to meet the deadline and agree on what is behind schedule. And for the most part, the majority is on schedule. But one important aspect is that there's discussion. There is public discussion about it. We engage civil society. We share it with them. We share it with the private industry. And we need to have them be our allies in giving us the feedback. And sometimes the government is not as happy about this, and sometimes we're not either. But it's the only way. It's really the only way that you can engage everybody, and you can get the influences to cross cut among the segments.
But Ambassador, we'll get to
Yeah.
you more, but Ambassador, there has to be a right balance, because if you push too hard, then you'll be accused of intervening in the internal affairs, right? That you are shaping, determining public policy of government X. So what's the right balance?
Well, having been accused of interfering on the gay and lesbian issue, and being accused of being in violation of the Geneva Conventions, I've gotten some practice at this. However, it is a fine line, but if we're convinced at the embassy that unless and until we are totally transparent and we bring everybody along with us, this is not going to work. And you run that risk sometimes, but you got to do it.
Okay.
And find that balance. Mark?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think that there are some very clear metrics in each sector in which we operate that we can use sort of as goals to work toward, but also to assess our success or lack thereof. One important metric, of course, would be the number of unaccompanied minors that are coming to the United States. And that number has dropped dramatically in the last few months and has actually held. It's been very important. In the area of citizen security, I would suggest two. One is murder rates. It's just a very, very visible. It's the easiest metric to count. But probably even more important when you're talking about development would be reduction in extortion rates. And that's what's really having an influence or it's really discouraging investment, both foreign and domestic. In the area of education, we put a lot of emphasis on early grade reading. So basically administering tests to assess whether reading skills are improving. Health indicators, health is an area where it's fairly easy to assess success. For example, if we're trying to reduce infant mortality. So I think in agriculture, we would be looking at increases in yields, increases in income for farmers, et cetera. So I think there's really there are very clear metrics we can use in every sector which we operate.
Yeah, there are also clear metrics in the justice system. Just one example would be the percentage or number of pretrial detainees. In Belize, it's excessively high. People who are waiting, I don't know how many cases, a high number over 2 years and a few 5 years, 7 years before they come to trial. Now, there may be various explanations for that, but that's certainly one thing that you can measure with cold numbers. And what's interesting in Belize, I just learned, is that at the magistrate level, which is more like the misdemeanor level, the magistrates have done much better than the full-fledged judges in reducing their caseload and complying with their whatever speedy trial rules they have. So there are other measurements. And then just one more thing. With respect to the timeline, I know all the programs that I have, the INL funds, they're like 5-year plans. I mean, there's an integrated country strategy, and we have to comply with that. And it's not like you're just throwing all the money and spending it in 1 year. It's planned out and has to be monitored, how it's spent, and so forth. So there's a plan to the distribution, of course.
And I would just say really quickly, for those who are impatient, I would just remind them of one clear success that did not happen over a short period of time, which is Colombia. If you look at Colombia today and remember how we were talking about Colombia 15 years ago, failed state.
Yeah.
It took a lot of money. It took even more money from the Colombians than we were putting in. It took a long time, but we got to where I think we're getting to where we're going to be. They may end the longest revolutionary rebellion in the hemisphere within the next year or two in Colombia, and that would really change the dynamic. And I would just say one other thing about Colombia, and Phyllis will back me up on this because we were both in Colombia together. Today, Colombia is a net exporter of security, which is a really important thing to think about after the 15-year mark, 15 years ago, where we were talking about them as a failed state.
Ambassador Moreno, let me come back to you. So this plan of these three countries, I don't believe Belize was involved in the drafting of.
You know, we
of
try to
that
get a
plan.
busload of unaccompanied children to be apprehended at the border, but we just don't have that issue in Belize.
So, and it's not clear, as a result, what part of that $1 billion might be coming to,
Very small.
yeah. But geography matters, proximity matters, right? You're right there in the northern frontier, and if we see success in Guatemala, Honduras, Belize could suffer, right? It could spill over into Belize. So in your conversations, or have you had these conversations with the Belizean government, what this means for Belize, and what are you thinking about?
Yeah, I think we're all acutely aware of what's commonly known as the balloon effect, that the more you squeeze these other countries, the more likely that Belize will be used not only as a transit point for money and drugs and transnational gang activities, but actually become under the foot of some of these transnational gangs, where we really want to preclude Belize from falling into the abyss and the depth of some of the problems that these associated countries have. So I think the government realizes that, and that's why we're doing as much as we can to prevent that from happening. Although we do have a very high homicide rate, on the order of 40 per 100,000. We're the third highest homicide rate in Latin America, the sixth in the world. That violence is pretty much confined. Half of it is confined to Belize City, which is very urban, inner city type of gang-infested area. But we want to stop that in its tracks from spreading out to the rest of the country. So as far as we can tell, we don't have the cartels and so forth openly operating in Belize, and we hope it stays that way.
Ambassador Power, so we've been talking a lot about citizen insecurity, but Nicaragua doesn't quite fit in terms of the levels of violence that we're seeing in other countries of Central America. Comparatively speaking, Nicaragua has had very low levels in terms of homicides per 100,000, et cetera. So do you see perhaps some of this, as it seems to be spilling over into Belize, could this possibly spill over into Nicaragua? Is this something that we need to be thinking and talking to the Nicaraguans about, although it's not an immediate problem or challenge? Could it become if the alliance program works?
Could it? Yes. We talked 15 years ago that there was no balloon effect when we entered into the full speed ahead with Plan Colombia. And I went from Colombia as NAS director to Peru as DCM. And there is a balloon effect. So it can happen, and we have to be aware of it. And I think the Nicaraguan government, in this respect on security issues, they're keeping their eye on it. They are very proud of their muro de contención for security, trying to keep the traffickers out. But you've got extreme poverty, you've got high unemployment, you've got a lot of internal issues that, with a push from external issues due to success in the other countries, could indeed put pressure on the security forces in Nicaragua and decrease the amount of security for citizens. They have a rather wide-ranging community security program where they have police units in small communities and working with the communities. But yeah, anything's possible. It could happen, and they look at it. They're talking to their neighboring countries, especially to the north with Honduras, because they're worried about that. But Nicaragua has not had unaccompanied minors going north in the numbers. I think there were 40 all told this past year that were interviewed in the United States as part of that influx of minor children that were traveling alone to the United States. So the pressures that are within Nicaragua are real, but it is not triggering that kind of violence and that kind of migration north.
So we're going to go here in a second to the audience. So just think about your questions and then raise your hand and I'll find you. So start thinking about it. But first, let me go to Ambassador Robinson. So Ambassador, if you could talk a little bit about CICIG, right? This very interesting, unique experiment in which the state has ceded its sovereignty in the legal area, in the judicial area, right? Because it feels that this tribunal could do a better job, a more impartial job than the court system that exists in the country. Some people have talked about maybe replicating this in other countries, maybe in Central America. Could you speak to that and where that is going here in the near future?
Sure. So CICIG is the Comisión de Impunidad in Guatemala, something like that.
It's CICIG.
The UN. It's the UN Commission. It started in 2007, and the idea was there are networks in Guatemala, some criminal, some political, others of other natures, read private sector. But there are networks in Guatemala that were seen as corrupting all levels of the judicial system. So from the judges down to the police, down to the investigators, down even in some instances to the cops on the street. And through a negotiation, the UN was invited by the government of Guatemala to set up a commission that would help, that would do a couple of things. It would, one, do investigations into these networks, and two, help transfer capacity to the Guatemalan officials, authorities, judicial authorities, to begin to do their own investigations. I would say, by everyone's standards, there's a mixed feeling about how successful CICIG has been. I don't think anyone thinks it wasn't necessary. They have had some successes. They have done some very successful investigations into mostly corruption networks that have been used to oftentimes change outcomes in judicial cases. The one really major thing that a lot of people forget, but I was there for part of it, in 2009, during the Colom administration, the president was accused of a murder. And CICIG was actually the only institution that anyone could rely on to investigate that allegation, show that, in fact, the president did not commit this murder. If CICIG had not been there, everyone agrees that government would have fallen, which would have been tragedy for Guatemala, for a government to go down that way. So we fast forward to 2014, 2015. We're in an election year. There are a range of interests in the country that see this as an opportunity to, I should back up and just say, every 2 years, the CICIG mandate comes up for renewal. We're in that 2-year period now. And there are interests in the country that think this is their opportunity to get rid of CICIG and in many ways keep their ability to influence the judicial system alive. Everybody mentioned governments having to make hard choices. I think President Perez Molina is he has to make a hard choice on this one. There is very little doubt that that Guatemala continues to need certainly capacity building in this area, but they also need an institution that can credibly do investigations because the networks that were out there, they're still there. Many of them are still there. The influence of drug trafficking organizations are still there. Kidnappings or extortions. The military, I think it was a colonel who killed one of the, was convicted of killing Archbishop Girardi in Guatemala, who was a major human rights figure. In prison, he's been in prison now for 10 years, something like that, and essentially was running his own little criminal organization out of the prison. CICIG just brought that to light, and he's now been moved and this kind of thing. No other organization in Guatemala is capable of doing that right now. So the government, the president has some hard decisions to make. The U.S. government's position has been clear from the start. We continue to support CICIG, but it is a sovereign decision of the government of Guatemala. If they choose to renew the mandate, and we think they should renew the mandate, the international community will continue to support it.
Great, thank you. If you could stand up, identify yourself, Miguel. Come to you next.
Yeah, Jose Miguel Cruz. I'm Director of Research at LAC. I grew up in El Salvador. I have a question for you, going back to the issue of patience, Frank said, and the $1 billion plan this time. I would like to ask you, what is the difference? Now, what is different this time from what the U.S. has been doing in Central America? I mean, this is not the first time. The U.S. is not starting to invest now in Central America. It's been investing in Central America for the last years, and especially in the last 20 years after the transition, it's been very committed in the region. So, but if we look at the situation now, it seems like something hasn't worked out very well. So what is the difference now in comparison to what has been done so far?
Want to start with you, Mark?
Sure. That's a great question. Thanks. I think a few things. First, there's a real recognition on the part of governments in the region, civil society, private sector, that they're living through a very, very serious crisis. And that has sort of helped to sort of galvanize people there. That's what has helped lead them to produce this plan, that the countries came together and produced their own plan for prosperity, which is notable, and it dovetails with the Central American strategy that the United States government has developed. I think along with that, they are increasingly, we can get some examples from some of the ambassadors here, the countries in the region are increasingly taking some tough steps. For example, in Honduras, we saw them institute a security tax, and we're seeing other efforts in the region to raise revenue, and that's really one of the biggest challenges, as you know, in the region. That revenue collection is very, very low. In fact, among the lowest in the world. We're also seeing efforts to combat corruption in a more serious way than we've seen in the past. We're seeing governments, for example, establish relationships or programs with Transparency International, which we find most encouraging. And I think we're able now to draw on the lessons that we've learned over the last few decades and recent years, and have a pretty clear sense of what works and what doesn't. I think also we've been able to draw upon perhaps the best example of the kind of success that's possible when you have a real effort to reduce crime and violence, and that's in the United States. I mean, rates of murder and other crimes have come down dramatically in the U.S. in the last 20 years. And we are now in Central America drawing on some of those best examples. So, for example, we have a partnership with Los Angeles And we're all familiar with the ties that exist between the gangs in LA and the gangs in Central America. In LA, they developed a tool by which they can, on an individual basis, assess the likelihood that a youth would join a gang. And then based on those results, put together a program for that individual involving him or her and their families and communities. And we now have the former deputy mayor of LA working with us in Central America. In Chicago, there's a ceasefire model, which we're able to take advantage of, which is basically an effort to interrupt violence, interrupt the cycle of violence. And we have people from Chicago working with us in Honduras. So I think by taking advantage of this political will that exists in the region, taking advantage of all the lessons that we've learned from our programs, looking at models in the United States and elsewhere in the region, I think that putting all that together, I think we're very well positioned to have additional success.
And I think just to modify that, rather acknowledging that the traditional war on crime has not worked, we really have to look at the roots of crime, so economic development, anti-gang efforts at a young age before they enter into the real criminal lifestyle. So it's roots of crime versus the traditional ways of fighting crime.
And actually, if I can briefly add, we globally are instituting what we call a new model of development. And there's often a tendency to focus on the size of our budgets, and that's important. It's important to invest resources. But there are three elements to our new model development that we're pursuing, not only in Central America, but throughout the region and really the entire world. First, we're trying to rely much less on US-based contractors and grantees. We want to be able to work directly with governments overseas and work directly with civil society groups overseas. And we've actually, over the last few years, doubled the amount of money that's going directly overseas as opposed to going through US organizations. Two, we just established what we call a lab, basically an office at USAID, which will allow us to take a better advantage of science and technology and establish relationships with universities in the United States and elsewhere, and really bring to scale some of the most creative innovations. And then third, we're doing a lot more public-private partnerships, and we're taking advantage of not only the resources that companies have, but also their expertise. And by doing all those things, we're really able to leverage the resources that we're able to invest.
Thank you, Frank. Let me begin by commending the wonderful job you've done here since you arrived
Thank
from
you.
the administration.
Thank you.
And I think it's evidenced by the strong group of ambassadors and Mark Farstein. My question is predicated on the President's announcement on December 17th of last year, wanting to pursue a different approach towards Cuba, predicated in part to help improve relations between the United States and various countries in Latin America. Assistant Secretary Jacobson last week testified before Congress that she already began to see evidence of this in her discussions with various governments, representative governments. They thought it was very positive, and she already began to see having an effect. I was wondering if any of you have those discussions with your host governments, and what is the response, or is it too early to tell?
Just quickly, the response was wholly positive by the government of Guatemala, to the point where I actually received a text from the foreign minister.
What did it say?
Felicidades. Wholly positive. They want to be helpful. It was a pretty amazing thing to see. And I will also add that the Cuban ambassador in Guatemala, who, well, he can be very formal, has been much less so since the announcement. There's a different atmosphere. I don't think that's across the board, but I think there's definitely a feeling that this is a good thing.
I think undoubtedly the announcement of December 17th saw the United States stock go up throughout most of Central and South America. However, it does not address the other challenges that are now starting as the new relationship develops. However, I can say that in El Salvador, who has had an active relationship with Cuba since I have been there in 2010, the Salvadorian government, of course, looked at this with I think with a sense of relief, because I felt that, as they have put it to me many, many times, this administration, which is a left-of-center administration and has some very hardcore ideologues in power, they wanted to not to offend us by saying that they would look south when they came into office, but that their relationship with the United States, as they put it, to use their word, was privilegiada. Esa era la relación privilegiada. La del sur, la del este, la del oeste. What's happening now is that reality is catching up, and ain't not much happening in the south. So reality is, it can be brutal at times, and has a way of changing people's behavior. And that's some of what we're seeing. But I also do want to say that the Cuban ambassador in El Salvador never even acknowledged me. It was like, ¿y esa quién es? So, and that has not changed. I see the government of El Salvador much better, much reacting in a more positive way than at least the Cuban delegation in El Salvador, who has not changed its modus operandi.
No cambia, no cambia. Tell you what, Randy.
Is that the same ambassador was there 3 years ago? So that you
Oh, yeah.
Randy.
Randy Pastana, Graduate Assistant, Latin American and Caribbean Center. Ambassador Nealon, can you talk about your relationship with President Hernandez and Minister Corrales, and any discussions you guys had about the militarized police and the proposed plebiscite you announced recently?
Sure. Digging down into the weeds a little bit here, but I'm happy to do that. I actually have a very constructive relationship with President Hernandez, who's been in power for a little bit over a year now, and with Minister Corrales, who until very recently was the Minister of Security, but who has just recently become the Foreign Minister again. The issue he's referring to is the issue of a military police force, commonly called by its initials in Spanish, the PMOP, the PMOP. This is a military police force that the president put on the streets shortly after he was inaugurated a little bit over a year ago. It has been controversial, certainly here in the United States. I guess I would say it is probably less controversial in Honduras. There's not a lot of polling data on it, but the polling data that we've seen shows that there's fairly substantial citizen support for the military police. From a policy perspective, the United States government has made a policy decision not to support the military police for I think, a very solid reason. We believe that we should be focusing our efforts on helping Honduras reform their civilian police force. We think that the sustainable future of law enforcement in Honduras and the ability of the country to bring down the levels of violence that we see there currently really depends on having a robust civilian police force. So that's where we're focusing our efforts.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi, David Bray. I'm a professor in the Earth and Environment Department here at FIU. I was actually going to ask a question about the security situation in Nicaragua that you mentioned, Frank. I would be interested to hear more about Nicaragua's success in that area. But since I'm in an environmental department, I guess I should ask a question about the environment. So I will raise the issue of climate change. And if in Vice President Biden's announced initiative there's going to be any money for adaptation or mitigation of climate change, or more generally, what is the U.S. government doing in Central American countries on the climate change issue?
Can I jump in there real quickly? It's a great question, and the Central American countries in general, and Honduras specifically, incredibly vulnerable to climate change and already well along in suffering from climate change, especially some of the most vulnerable agricultural producers out in the western part of the country. So the U.S. government, through the largesse of this man here, has been engaged for a long time in trying to mitigate the effects of climate change, specifically drought and lack of water, which has really not only affected the lives of very vulnerable people, but also is one of the drivers of migration. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that in Honduras, at least, rural people are driven to migrate by poverty, whereas urban people more driven by the security situation. So doing some very, very creative work in the so-called dry corridor of Honduras, in the cosecha de agua, how to capture water, how to ration water, and how to increase yields in an environment that's actually very unforgiving. And we've been very, very successful in doing that and actually lifting people out of rural poverty and allowing them to multiply their yields by 5, 6, 7 times. So that's one of the areas where we would really want to double down if we do end up getting more money.
Mark, do you want to talk to
No,
that
that's
issue?
well said. Yeah.
Okay. I think I saw a hand up here. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Albert Perez, you've demonstrated definitely your objectives and your successes, but what would you say, respectively, is the greatest challenge for your objectives, economic prosperity, et cetera, in your countries?
In 2 minutes, wow. In Guatemala, hands down, corruption is the biggest obstacle. It's everywhere. It's at all levels. It is driving good people from the country. It is the number, in my opinion, for as long as since I've been there in October, it is the one thing that everyone during the course of their day, it touches them, it influences their life. And if we could find a way to break that cycle, the corruption cycle, we would be making a huge step forward, I think, in Guatemala.
I think in El Salvador, polarization is a huge problem, meaning that the lack of trust between the private sector and the government, because the government were the former guerrillas, and for the private sector, they have no legitimacy. So there has to be some consensus that needs to be built, some trust, and that has to happen, in our judgment, from trying to work together, even if it's starting in modest projects that affect everybody, such as security, such as prevention for youth entering the gangs, and the number, a crime that affects everybody in El Salvador, extortion. Because even if you bring the homicides down, if people are extorted because they can't get in their own house without paying la renta, we're not getting anywhere. So that building those consensus around those issues that affect everybody is a big project in El Salvador.
Ambassador
Yeah, I
Romero?
would say for Belize, what first comes to mind is a political partisanship. Wait, that's the United States. I've been astounded how political benefits that the government hands out are really determined by whether you're red or blue, your party affiliation. So certain municipalities really suffer disproportionately, and it's totally inequitable. And I think that is really the bane of the existence of the country. Secondly, I think an inferior educational system that really doesn't, provide the kind of education that young people are going to need to compete. And even where a young person completes the school curriculum, there are no jobs. So I think economic development, we just need to create a place for those young people to be able to work and employ, use their skills that they've learned in whatever educational institution they've attended. So, but political partisanship really is a big issue.
Ambassador Powers?
What isn't an impediment? No, seriously. And it's what is an impediment, not just for programs we have going on or our interaction with the government or the people of Nicaragua. What is the major impediment for them is a lack of an education system that is preparing the young people of that country, 75% of the population under 35, not adequately preparing them to compete in the 21st century. And without a reform of the education system top to bottom, starting with preschool and primary grade reading, keeping kids in school and making sure they have the education and the nutrition so they can absorb the education, is the key thing that is going to keep Nicaragua from achieving goals of reducing poverty and economic growth in their country, in my view, because it's fundamental, and it isn't where it needs to be.
Ambassador Neela?
Yeah, just briefly, obviously in Honduras, it's the violence that gets all the headlines. And I mentioned that statistic of 86 murders per 100,000 people in 2012. But last year, in 2014, that number's been driven down to 66 per 100,000. It's a 25% drop in 2 years. And I just saw the figures for January of this year, and they show a further steep decline. So there's obviously considerable momentum there now in driving down that number, which, as Mark said, is really an important indicator. So granted that there is some momentum now on reducing violence, the issue that I think is the toughest nut to crack in Honduras is the issue of impunity. That is, the crimes that go unpunished.
Great.
I'd say two things. One is the weight of history. We're obviously dealing with issues whose roots go back, centuries. I mean, to the extent, for example, that Guatemala is one of the most unequal societies in the world, that goes back to the colonial period, and we're still, dealing with that. Two, I'd say, and this was referenced, political division. Development is not a technical process; it is a political process. And before we heard about how well planned Colombia has gone and how much Colombia has advanced in the last 15 years, and a lot of that had to do with Colombian society coming together, the parties there coming together, and the broader society coming together around a common agenda. And we're starting to see hints of that now in Central America, but it needs to go further to really have the kind of success that Colombia had.
Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. I know our guests have had a long day today, so I want to thank you all for being here. This was incredibly insightful, informative, and I know the audience got a lot out of it. So once again, thank you so much for being here with us. So please join me in